So Nate, why don't we talk about the format of Syslog?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's get a couple lines out of our log messages here and use that as an example. All right. So these logs are all written by the same logging application, right? So they all follow the same format, which is important because if you're like me, usually when you're trying to troubleshoot a problem, the first place you go is logs. And if you've been doing it long enough, you've probably developed a whole bunch of like command line grep awk sed foo to try to find exactly what you're looking for in a log file. Now, there's probably better ways. We could go into log analysis tools and things that you might do off box. But if you're physically at Bash and just need to find out what happened in a log file, this format is super important to you. So that's why I thought we'd cover it today. We start out with the date and timestamp, right? When it was built, it says it's already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That probably means that it's running on GMT instead of on my local time because my local time is about 4 hours like before that at the moment. It's currently noon here. This says that it's 4 o'clock. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these log files. This is going to go based on the system time, not your time. This is hard to read and doesn't match what you're seeing at the command line, but this is the system's host name. I checked on a couple other RHEL boxes to make sure that I was not misremembering what that column meant. And it is, in fact, the host name. This must have something to do with the way our compute machines are built when we provision these labs. And then the process ID that ran it, right? Or the process ID that logged it, I should say. So in this case, the process ID is process ID number 1, which is SystemD, right? You can see this one here. There was a Google Compute Engine thing that ran, and that was process ID 2286. This gives you an idea of what generated this log, and now you can go figure out what that was and why it was running. And then, of course, it's the log itself. The log could be anything from those simple things that I did with Logger to more detailed things like you're seeing here. Finished GCE workload certificate refresh. This even included the date and time. This all comes down to what the thing that ran is configured to log, right? And you can make an application that doesn't log anything, right? And then you would see nothing in the logs. That's probably bad practice, but there you go. That's the format.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out the hostname field. I put the hostname in there because I know this is the host on which the log
Hmm.
was created. The real reason is because we can aggregate our logs to another location. Some people do this already with third-party applications like Splunk, where they aggregated all their logs through Splunk or Elasticsearch. The native tool is through RSyslog, which would send all your logs to a central host. If you send all your logs from all your hosts to one host, how do you know which log is from where? So the
Right.
hosting is what tells you that.
And there are mechanisms within Journal D. I think there's an add-on application you have to install that will do remote logging. You can have Journal D send it to a remote system. You can even have Journal D act as a remote log recipient, right? If you care about that. And there are lots of cases where you should. Centralized logging has a ton of benefits, especially from a security perspective and a log preservation perspective, which is very important in a lot of industries. In fact, it's very important, I would say, to any administrator who doesn't want to have their logs lost in the event of a system failure or a breach. Remote logging isn't important. If you're not doing it, you should look into it. Okay, so there's a couple other things I wanted to touch on, and really it's more stuff about Logger and Journal D, and I'm going to put them together because I can show you both at the same time because we're going to be making logs and viewing logs. We already showed some simple examples of how Logger works. Another thing you can do with Logger is you can tell it what process ID to log. By default, when Logger runs, it logs its process ID. So if I just did another Logger and then I did a tail on messages, it'll show you that it was run as root 2292. This is probably the process ID of my bash shell or of the Logger process that ran. Now, what I can do with Logger is I can tell it what ID to run as. Let's just say ID number 40. I have no idea what ID 40 is on this system, but we're just going to use it at random. Then we'll do, this is another log. And if I did a tail on messages, again, we're going to see now process ID number 40. It doesn't necessarily get the name of the process. Like if I did another one with process ID number 1, it wouldn't say syslog. It still tells me what ran the thing. So now it says process ID 1. But if I'm doing a good job of trying to correlate my logs to the thing that's running, if I'm running a bash script, for example, I can get that bash script's process ID from the environment when it's running. And then I could substitute that inside of the bash script to say, run logger, substitute the process ID, And that way, if I'm trying to correlate logs later, I can use the process ID to correlate what are all the logs that came out of this script, right? That's really the main use for that. Now, we also talked a bit about priorities. That's
So
the other thing
Nate,
I wanted to show you. Oh, go ahead.
if you recall your previous command and you put in instead of a number, a $,
Dollar, double dollars.
okay,
And you-
up higher, you have process 2292.
Yep,
That was the PID of the logger command. 216 is the process ID of the shell that was running logger.
there you go. Double dollars. I knew there was a shortcut to get the process ID. I just couldn't remember what it was off the top of my head. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to show you, and this will actually lead nicely into some journal control stuff, which is that priority I showed you. Remember we did authpriv.warn before? You can just specify a priority. Journal D will also highlight that. Scott and I were talking before the show. If you do an emergency, it'll also show it like on the console log if you were physically at the terminal. It doesn't do a message within your SSH sessions, unfortunately, which might be helpful. Maybe you can configure that. I don't know. But what I wanted to show you was I just made a quick for loop here that'll do all of them. We're just going to assign a priority. What we're doing is for the numbers 0 through 7, because those are the number of priorities that you can do. We're going to make a log. We're going to set the priority to that number, and we're just going to say test level and then that number. If I run that, there's no output because it all went to logs. If I look at var log messages, you just see, and of course, something got in the middle of it on me. That's really nice. You can see that it did test level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And it logged them. If I do a journal CTL, you can see when I do journal CTL, it highlights them for me, right? So if I did journal CTL XE, it jumps to the end of the log is what the E does, and X adds this additional information, right? But you can see level 0 shows up as red. And then levels 1, 2, 3 all show up red. But then we move into the warning stages. Test level 4 is warn, and that shows up yellow. And everything beyond that is meant to be notification and debug level stuff. And that's why it goes from white to then gray, right? So it's nice to be able to format this stuff. If your program uses these priority symbols, when you look at it in Journal CTL, it'll color code it so that you can better identify stuff just by sight. Oh, that one's red. Maybe I should look at that one first. Or this one's gray. It's probably just a bug output. So I think that's actually really handy. It's a nice feature of Journal CTL where you didn't get in the old school RSyslog and var log messages text files because displaying color in a text file is kind of hard. I used those arguments X and E for Journal CTL. If you just run Journal CTL, it starts at the beginning. By beginning, I mean the very first entry in the journal, which is when the system booted up. Unless you're looking for things that happened when the system booted, that's probably not where you want to look anyway. I almost always use the E flag when I'm looking at anything because I want to know what just happened, not what happened 3 days ago or 3 months ago when the system booted. Otherwise, you'd have to use G or something to skip to the end. Go ahead, Scott.
That information is also stored in varlog bootlog.
So anyway, I don't know why it doesn't default to just jumping to the end. You'd think that would be a logical default, but whatever. And then the X, like I said, adds in that extra, I forget what the actual command is, or the actual option is called, but it adds in this extra information. I think that's why it's X, because it's literally called something like extra information, extended maybe. It pulls out this external stuff, right? And in this case, it's even bringing in a support document or a link to our support in case you needed help. I thought there were cases where it can sometimes point to deeper documentation on a thing. It all depends on how much journald knows about that particular log entry. So that's useful stuff. If you don't care about that, just drop the X. The other thing is everything gets logged into journald. So you can see here, even things like logs from your services that have started and stopped, those will end up in the system journal. Sometimes it's handy to filter that down to a specific service that you care about. Right? So you can do a system CTL status on a service, and it'll give you a truncated output. This is what it has in the system journal for SSHD. It truncates it, and it doesn't give you a ton of information. It gives you the last couple of lines. If you did a journal CTL-XE, because I like those options, you don't have to use those options, but I use them. XEU for unit. You can say what SystemD unit you care about. Then you can do SSHD, the shorthand SSHD is fine. This will give me all the log output that came from SSHD. So you could imagine if I'm running Apache, I would just say HTTPD. If I'm running a database, I'd be looking at MariaDB or something like that. This is handy because you don't have to go hunt down that services log file to find this information. You don't have to filter it out through varlog messages like you would have had to in the past. You can just say journal control, give me this particular services output. You've got that services output. And that'll work for anything controlled by systemd. You could do it on a timer or a port, a socket, whatever, anything that's logged through systemd that generates log output, you should be able to get this way.
Hey, Nate, can you do a service status for RSyslog?
Is it RSyslog or RSyslogD? I don't remember anymore. There you go. Hey, it is running. Look at that.
Yeah. So it turns out that while many things log to journald, not everything logs to journald. So we also run RSyslog. And RSyslog is who is maintaining a lot of that content in varlog. So varlog messages, varlog secure, RSyslog is still doing all of that logging. And it turns out the journald by default on Red Hat Enterprise Linux systems is set to forward those messages to RSyslog, which is how they end up in those files.
Ah, there we go. I knew I should have dug deeper into that before we started the show.
No, a guy who knows all about RSyslog.
Except what's in audit D. Varlog audit log.
Well, specifically SE Linux messages. We can see why they might or might not end up there. How about that?
There we go.
So in our episode guide, Nate, I threw in RSyslog, and I can cover that if you are
cool. Yes, I am. Well, actually, I guess there's one other thing. If you noticed that when I do these journal CTL commands, they go into a pager, and that pager is, I think it's just less. It just throws it into something that you can search through, you can scroll up and down, which is great, unless you're trying to pipe them into something else. If you needed to do that, there's another option you throw in here called --no -pager. And it'll just, because the -u was looking for the service name. Anyway, it'll just dump it to the screen, right? And it looks the same, still has the same color coding, still has the same output, but it's not in a pager. So now I could pipe that into something like, I don't know, grep for the word server, right? And there we go. Now I have all the lines that just say server. So if you're used to grepping and awking and all that stuff, and you don't want it to be inside of less, you can do it through there. Although with less, you can do a search, which I think is actually really helpful. That's something that was always hard to do unless you just piped it into less from the old school text files. Okay, now I'm done.
My preference is --no -pager.
Yeah.
We actually did have a question. Are there any circumstances where Logger can fail to make log entries that you are aware of?
Any circumstances, that's pretty broad. I would say yes, there's always a chance. Imagine you're on a system that is in a very bad situation, like it's out of memory or something. It can't start a new process. I would think Logger might fail in that particular situation, right? Unless it has some escalated rights or privileges within the kernel that says you can always run. But I don't know. I'd have to try it. I'd have to look into it.
I think there's a couple other more common situations where that might be the case. So if you're on older RHEL, Logger didn't go to journald, but newer RHEL, it goes to journald. So it could be that RSyslog wasn't running, and that's why you didn't see Logger show up, because you weren't running that daemon that was handling Logger messages. It could be that you set a priority or facility that didn't go into files, in which case we wouldn't store it because it was received by the logging subsystem, and it was like, my rules say I don't care about this.
Right. Right.
That's, I think, the most likely reason why Logger wouldn't log a thing.
See, I go right to the catastrophe. You look for like reasonable reasons. You know, if the sun were to burn out, I bet Logger would stop working.
Indeed.